So the word critical is both clear and confusing. It is clear because we know it means the most important. It is confusing because it gives us no help whatsoever to figure out how to figure out what's most important. What I want to talk to you about today is share with you my journey and experience wrestling with this word and thinking about defending the critical infrastructure of the city of New York. So to go back to before the pandemic, when I first started at the city, I was the director of cyber risk. And one of the ideas we were trying to figure out is, how do you evaluate the loss of a service? What does it mean if a service is gone? How do you measure that? And we really struggled with this idea because New York is pretty resilient and can come back from a lot. So to ask people to imagine that a service isn't there, that you can't go to a school, that you can't get a permit, that the traffic lights aren't working, really stretched people's imagination. And then the pandemic happened. We didn't have to stretch people's imaginations. Something else happened too. And I hope, maybe you had this experience as well, which is at the end of the beginning of the pandemic, when we knew we were in a pandemic, and we started to realize that this affected everyone, people started to think about groups of people for whom, if they got sick, it was going to be a real problem. Doctors, nurses, pilots, teachers. We knew that if that group, everyone started to realize that if that group gets sick, we are in a downward spiral in terms of our capacity to respond to this. That group, critical. We all understood that. But we still didn't know exactly how we got there. The other thing that happened is everyone experienced the pandemic, but their experience of it was so local. People got to know their mayors and their local public health. That's how a lot of people experienced the response was local. So there was a wide-scale incident that everyone experienced locally. I think many of you have probably seen this before. How many of you have seen this before? Okay, maybe some of you haven't. This is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'll give you just a few seconds to take it in. It's pretty intuitive. Abraham Maslow was an American psychologist, educated in New York City, product of a number of the institutions. He had a fairly simple idea. There are certain needs that humans need to address before others. That's it. And then he ranked this hierarchy of needs. And this, I think, again, should make intuitive sense. You need food and water before you think about a job. But the pandemic tested a lot of this. Now, I'm presenting this to you not because we had this really clear idea, we're going to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs and apply that across the city. I'm giving it to you in reverse. At the end, I was like, oh, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And there's some debate about this hierarchy, by the way, that it's culturally specific, that it only applies in Western societies, and you can see that there's a question there. But what's not at question is that there is a hierarchy. We are sometimes afraid to say that is more important than that. And some of that can be technical. That depends on that. But other is you can't think about that other thing until you address this. So I want to tell you a quick story about my first day at New York City Cyber Command. I was then, like I am today, underprepared and overdressed. And I showed up and I was taking the subway, which you know, you've been to New York even once, but even if you haven't, you know, is the artery. So I was taking the subway. I was thinking about my first day. I had already been to the government office building, so I had my expectations managed about what I was walking into. But I was talking to someone on my first day, and all these ideas were going around in my mind, and this is a true story. I'm mildly embarrassed, but I have no shame, so it does not matter. And so I got there, and I was like, wow, the subway, like, how do we think about cyber defense of the subway? The person said, we don't. I was like, haha, what do you mean? And they were like, the subway is governed by the MTA, which is part of the state. That's not something that we, the city, necessarily have purview over. And they went about their day. And I stood there being like, uh-oh. What do you mean? Like, how does that work? I'll come back to that later. So we started to think about, back to the loss of services, we started to think about different lenses that we could use to prioritize. What would a New Yorker notice first? What would they make the biggest deal out of? So if the power went out, you know immediately, right? You know immediately. If you were on the subway or in an elevator and that stopped working, yes, you would notice immediately, and you wouldn't have many alternatives. We think about contingency. There's immediacy, visibility, contingency. And then, let's say the trash stopped getting picked up. Would you notice immediately? No. And they do their best, DSNY, New York's strongest. But you might not notice immediately, but when you noticed, it would have a huge impact. How do we trade off against these? This brought to a larger question. How does the city plan for outages? Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that here because that's a whole separate talk that someone else can and should give around disaster response, emergency management within the city. But the key point is that they had planned to a certain extent for the idea of responding to an outage. That response mechanism was there, but again, the prioritization up front, there wasn't clarity, there surely wasn't consensus. And I tried to push and say, okay, well, yeah, this one is more important. And there was a rough tiering, but when it came down to it, we really needed to know. So now I want to talk to you about what are the challenges that I faced in trying to do this. And I'm talking now to people who are maybe going to try and do this, or want to try and do this, or have tried and can maybe are stuck on one of these. So the first was, again, just the foremost, there's a consensus around the criticality, but no agreement on the definition. When I asked, and I did, many people as I could in the city, you know, DHS has these 16 critical infrastructure sectors. How do those map to the city? Where do those line up? What? I don't, we think about it this way. That's interesting that that's there. No one was dismissive of it per se. That's interesting that that's there, but this is how we think about it. So then I started to look at others, Canada, Australia, for other ideas, and there isn't even consensus there. Now, I'm not proposing that there be something universal, but there needs to be something central, if not similar. And I started to scratch on this a little bit, that cities share a lot more in many ways than countries. The other key component is that services are not delivered through sectors. That will either be patently obvious to you or brand new. And it was both to me. Working in the city, and when I would talk to my colleagues at agencies, and they would think about what they did as part of their agency mission and the service that they provided. That's how they, and when I worked there, we thought about what we do. But if you ask someone in the city of New York, what's your experience with the chemical sector? Right? It doesn't really line up. And even the water sector, they might know the agency, they wouldn't know much more than that. I'll give you one example. And the example I'm going to give you, all of this comes from collective learning, from talking to other people. So colleagues who work in cyber defense in healthcare and hospital systems particularly. I asked as many people as I could across the different sectors that were represented in the city, which sectors line up with you and who do you depend on, and those kinds of questions. But okay, so tell me about healthcare and public health. Well, the first thing you need to know is that it's not just healthcare and public health in a hospital. A hospital includes, and now going to the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, healthcare and public health, transportation, nuclear, chemical, commercial facilities. 5 sectors, at least, are subsumed in that one. You can say, oh, okay, well, I see there's complexity and across those, but it's not the right lens. It was unhelpful for the kind of work that we were trying to do, which involved prioritization and also, and you know this and appreciate this, communication. I need to influence other groups to focus on. that. So if I said, okay, there's 16 sectors, and these are the 5, and now I'm talking numerators and denominators, what's 5/16? I don't know. Like, not helpful for our purpose. Then we had to come to an agreement about what was relatively important. That required some assumptions. And I'll talk about how we tested some of those assumptions through scenarios and incidents. Did use CISA's national critical functions. How many of you have seen the set of national critical functions? A few nerds probably raised their hand. Hello. Hello, fellow nerds. 55. You thought 16 was a lot, 15 is a lot. But there is an overarching logic. There's 4 big areas. They line up under connect, distribute, manage, and supply. There are things like manage wastewater, supply electricity, connect electricity, provide law enforcement, protect sensitive information. So it's much more about the how. It's getting closer to services, but it's not quite there. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, the sector-based approach really sets up blind spots around interdependencies, cascading failure, and other ideas. It's not that people don't think about them, it just doesn't naturally happen. So these are the challenges we had coming in. What I proffer to you is that services, in this lens, are a more effective way to think about prioritization. The other challenge that I found was that sectors vary widely on maturity, the type of OT that they use, the regulatory pressures that are there, the size, the big players, the number of players, the supply chain. But when we started to think about it through services, they were more comparative. They weren't the same. It didn't normalize everything, but it did give us something that was comparative because those services drew from different sectors. So that started to enable us to more effectively allocate resources and talk about it in a clear, consistent way. I say started because still started. One of the things we needed to do was define, to test some of our assumptions and understanding of what's critical, is do our own version of what does it look like when it's under duress, under attack. And so we did some scenarios where we looked at incidents focused on critical infrastructure. And we had a grid, it's a 2x2, you can picture it in your head. Single vector, multi-vector, single sector, multi-sector. And we went through each of those. So single vector, okay, yes, cyber. Multi-vector, cyber and climate event, cyber and terrorism. We had ERCOT in Texas and Colonial Pipeline. Those 2 things happened. They didn't happen at the same time. Doesn't require a stretch of imagination to imagine them lining up. And then we looked at single sector. One of the things that became clear is that, wonderfully, people are focused on their institution, their entity, and then the benchmarks, the other entities around it, and the sector writ large. So I can only speak, in my experience, what it was in New York, but those sectors were pretty robust. They were lined up next to each other. They're in the same room. They have those great relationships. But as soon as it flipped over to another sector, we don't talk to them. I don't know who to talk to. Why would we? You know the answer. Because you share the same operational tech, folks. Like, if there's a problem and it happens there, you're going to be in the same boat, and we're not going to know until we're all experiencing it. This is the thing that kept me up at night. It's also the thing that got me up in the morning, but New York is a city that never sleeps, so it's fine. And so we set that threshold of, okay, it occurs simultaneously in multiple sectors. You know, we did this sort of incident, and we saw where there were gaps, and it was really that multi-sector that we wanted to focus on. So just laying out, I'll call it a framework, but it's really an overlay of thinking about these 4 categories of services: public safety and emergency services, public health and welfare, community services, financial stability, and economic health. Now, if you're familiar with the conventional definition, the DHS definition at least, of critical infrastructure, this sounds really similar. And in some ways it is. But there's a city lens on here that I want to unpack with you. So we took all the agencies, all the city services, and we looked at how the city thinks about them, and we mapped those to the critical infrastructure sectors and the national critical functions and came up with this lens of service delivery. And we're going to look at this and go, yeah, And I hope that's the case. You look at this and recognize it doesn't look strange. So first category, life safety, unequivocally there's issues of life and death. And back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's going to be our first and foremost. And it's not just because you need to address that first, it's because that's what people think about first. So if you try and put something ahead of that, you'll run into this confusion. I ran into that a lot. If we didn't overtly say, yes, this is how we're dealing with public health, or yes, this is how we're dealing with sanitation, someone would say, but what about? And so there's a real need to prioritize that in our communication. So emergency management, law enforcement, those ones are clear. Public health, sanitation, water and wastewater. I know you know these from the work that you do, but the services that are being provided and how agencies line up, I believe that if one started to use this lens and talk to someone who worked in a municipality, they'd recognize it. Yes, I know the agency that does that. I know where that fits for us. The second category is a really interesting one. It's very broad. Now, there are going to be some issues of life and death in this category. But in all of these, this is something where a city is the provider. There is no alternative. There's no alternative to the Department of Homeless Services, to the fire department, to sanitation. There's no one else who's going to do that. There's no one else who has that charge, that mission, that responsibility, that duty of care. And that's something that a longtime colleague of mine really introduced. He said, I think, and he'd been with the city for a long time, and he said, when we think about in the city, you're under the care of the city. Stewards of that. That's where the second category comes in. Education, elections, yes, healthcare, shelters, corrections, and technology. And shelters get to issues around public health. Corrections gets to issue of life safety. But these are things that are harder to put a frame around. And then the last is boring and yet so important, processing and management. Tax collection, fees, payments, payroll, permits. There's two reasons that's really important. One, the money collected from that funds all the other stuff. And two, pays the people that do all that other stuff. Payroll processing, crucial. Think back to the hierarchy of needs, right? Like, how am I going to get paid? So the other part is, let me go back to this for a second. These are all things that a city, City of New York, but a city, municipality provides. Public sector. It rests crucially on other sectors that are almost entirely private sector. Telecommunications, data, electric and power, cargo. When I talked to the folks that work on those services and I said, what do you most need? What are you most going to need in a time of cyber crisis? Or what do you want to make sure is going to be steady and stable? They pointed to these. Great, we have agreement on those. Now what? We need those for our critical services, but they're not in our purview of control. This is where the partnership aspect came in. But really identifying those dependencies and calling that out. To me, there is no way to defend critical infrastructure but collectively. I don't know how else to think about it. The other thing that came up for me, and this is a brief aside, but I want to put it in here, is the frame lots of times is utilities, so water and electricity. But the more I started to talk to people, the more I realized that data is also utility. It has the same issues around jurisdiction, around generation, distribution, transmission. It doesn't really matter how it's used, in one sense. In one sense, it does matter. We think a lot about how the data is used, but in the other, it's just about getting the data there. Cloud providers, that kind of framing came in there. The other thing that came up to me here was concentration risk. I would talk to each of the sectors and some of the different organizations and say, who do you most depend on? And everybody named this one provider that I was like, right, okay, besides that, they said, oh, for our backup or whatever, yeah, we depend here. I talked to them. And what I realized is that a lot of those organizations were dependent on this one party that no one was really paying attention to. There's a concentration risk. What Dale was talking about earlier. It was known, it was there, people knew it. We just need to draw the pathway to it. So this lens of services and then sectors, so I'm not saying eschew sectors, it's just putting that service lens first, is really helpful. Okay, so I want to share some resources here that were really helpful for me, that I hope are helpful for you, especially if you're trying to undertake this journey. In 2015 and 2016, MIT did a series of workshops where they looked specifically about sector dependency. And to no one's surprise, they found electricity at the core of it. Okay. They also found some other key dependencies, and how do we build those in? So I encourage you to look at the results of that. Another is an exercise from West Point, the Army, called Jack Voltaic. It was specifically focused on multi-sector incidents and municipalities. Now you might think, oh, isn't that what you were looking for? Yeah, we built a lot of work on top of that. But we also needed to customize it and adjust, but it was really great to have that lens and build on top of that, and it's continued. The national critical functions I talked about, where they could be complex or a little bit challenging, but they are also a really close lens to how we are providing what we're providing that's critical. And I took those and sort of mapped and lined them up and made my own version of them and shared that back with the folks at CISA, and they were very open to that. Great, it's great for us to see how people are using this set. And the last is the Analysis and Resiliency Center. Now they're focused primarily on the financial sector, but they think a lot about systemic risk. This was a hard thing not just to think about, but to communicate about. Remember those cascading failures and interdependency? It can get kind of overwhelming. Think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you say, yeah, what if this hits this, hits that? And people go, no, I'm just thinking about this first. I need to think about this first. And so it helped put that scale in there. A few limitations, caveat emptor here. Metropolitan, right? Not all cities and counties. I think people say state and local, tribal territories, SLTT, it's all encompassing. No, it's not. The density and population, not just of New York, but of those metropolitan areas, some of these challenges around distribution of services and application of those services really does vary widely. We will make different decisions on shelters and education, other things based on density and population, so that's a very important factor. Governance, I talked about the subway. So transportation in the city of New York, there's the Department of Transportation, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and the State Department of Transportation and the MTA. If you ever fly into New York, those three airports, that's controlled by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is co-governed by the state of New York and the state of New Jersey. What? So if we have a challenge in transportation, how do we do this? There is no answer but together, collectively. I will underline again the point about taxation and revenue generation because different cities set this up in different ways. There's different taxation, but that was a really important factor when we talked about prioritization. And then I will just underline again, this is just me, my experience, just the city of New York. And it is unique, but it is not peerless. So back to this, I encourage you to think differently. I invite you to think differently about scale and scope, severity of that impact, the number of people, how long it will last, when they will notice, not to lose the human side. And the last is some of the applications here. I talked a little bit about the prioritization, but what it allowed us to do is more effectively allocate those resources to think about mutual aid and assistance in a time of cyber crisis. Where would we get that support from? Who would provide it? Who should we all go to first? And did the resourcing line up there? Answer, no, didn't, and hasn't. And then most important, in my mind, is as a communication tool. So I invite you to challenge this, to test it, to try it, talk to me about it. But I think we all can agree that one of the biggest challenges in security, operational technology, ICS, is around communication. Coming back to this word and the power of that one word, I hope you have a bit better understanding of what that word means, how to think about it. Thank you. You have some time for questions? Yes? Go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I did have a question. So given your adventure of dealing with a lot of different stakeholders, do you have any pro tips to share in terms of trying to bring people to like a common understanding, just even the language, right?
Yeah,
Can be a real
yes.
challenge. So interested in you sharing about that.
Yeah, a few things. The first is I started with the least mature sectors. I didn't go to the most mature sectors. Those mature sectors are used to people coming to them and saying, hey, how can you help? What do you think? So I started with the least mature sectors. That's number one. Number two, I asked everybody, who do you most depend on? Who do you need to be strong for you to be strong? And that did two things. One, it started to give me a short list of that central element. And two, it started to get them to think about dependencies, third parties, other things like that. Other questions I asked them, and I was with the government at the time, so I said, what are you not getting that you need? Because I assume that if someone needs something, they're getting it. But what are you not getting that you need from us? There are two questions in there. What are you not getting that you need? Okay. And then from us. And then there was just general consensus like, do you have a clear way in your sector of the way you define criticality? No. Would you be open to that? What is needed? Where is the, how do you influence that thinking, all of that? I hope that answered your question a bit. I got another question in the app that I'll answer real quick. Has this been tested or tabletop? No, and I would love it. I would love it. We got to the point where, if you're familiar with the tri-sector, it's three sectors that have come together. We said, here, try your operational exercise and incident response under this. Let's see if this lens works. Because you said you're working across sectors, so let's try it through this lens. Other questions? You can just shout them out. Yeah. Finance, electricity, telecommunications.
Say I love this presentation, and I think it's one of the very valuable ones that I wish that I know that the room was packed, but I mean even more so with people. I think what you're really talking about, and it's more of a comment than a question, but I will ask a question from a FEMA-oriented purview in a second. This is about maturing cyber as a proper disaster science. I do believe that we've erred in some ways, and that yes, there needed to be an intense concentration on cyber because we're so weak on capability. But at the same time, we've lost some of the basics that emergency managers know to be true.
100%.
When I'm looking at your presentation, I'm like, man, this also directly drives with continuity of government. Mission essential functions versus business essential functions like payroll, delegations of authority. Who actually has the power during an event to make decisions if other people become ill or otherwise incapacitated to make the decision. This all just ties in so well, and I just want to thank you because I think that you're one of the few thought leaders that is making these connections between cyber and emergency management, and quite frankly, it just makes so much sense. I think it's part of an awakening, so thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I appreciate that. I will say I've built on some of the work that Megan's done, so the feeling is mutual, and it really is, why are we rebuilding a thing that already exists, right? That capacity, that capability, even the language, we shouldn't have to duplicate that. Yeah, question.
One of the constraints I didn't see on the slide, but I'm sure is in your mind and everyone's mind, is resources, right? It's not infinite, right?
Yeah.
So did you ever have to tackle with how you allocate resources so not only are the most critical underlying things more resilient, but also you don't lose the things that they are underlying for, right?
Yeah.
If you secure all the power systems, but no hospitals can work, then what does it matter that you've got the power? So how have you had to deal with that challenge? And if so, do you have a way of thinking about making sure you not only strengthen the backbone, but also the things that require that backbone for operation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it ties to a bit what Megan was talking about. One of the reasons, and it wasn't intentional, but it worked out this way, and it was fantastic. One of the reasons we use critical infrastructure is because there wasn't a question about, we're going to defend that. That needs to work. So if we need to figure out how we're going to work with emergency management, we know we got to figure it out for this. To your question about resourcing and resource dependency, we got into it a bit when we looked at mutual aid and assistance. How are we going to support? Because I asked people, if you are having a bad day, who are you willing to support? If you are having a bad day, who are you willing to support? That helped get to that critical dependency. and the crucial paths there. Because yeah, the telecommunications folks were like, we need the roads to be cleared. And yes, of course, we need power. We need water for cooling. Hospitals were like, we can't do it without 48 hours of fresh water, and you can't just have water lying around. You have to truck it in, right? So all these interdependencies started to show up. So I think it was really highlighting those interdependencies that was helpful. That's all my time. Thank you so much.